my name is Emily Bloom, and I'm going to be speaking today about blindness and insight in Teresa Deevy's radio plays. So, from the 1940s through the 1960s, most of Teresa Deevy's plays were written for radio, and they reached their listeners at home rather than in a theater. This was during a period of time when Deevy had fallen out with the Abbey Theater, and also when radio was a booming medium for writers. To the extent that critics have addressed Deevy's radio drama, they have expressed surprise that a deaf writer was able to write for an auditory medium. There's often an unstated assumption here that she wrote for radio under duress when other options for her work had dried up. Now, to some extent, this is true. In a letter to her close friend and fellow playwright Florence Hackett, she describes going to the BBC's Belfast studios with a sense of trepidation, feeling doubtful as to whether I could ever be really enthusiastic over writing for radio. But by the end of the visit, she reports having been entirely won over. So this is Deevy's description of going to BBC's Belfast studios for the first time. I loved the place and their way of production. I would love you to come sometime with me. It was most interesting to watch the rehearsal. We spent one evening at that. Another evening, we were in a panel room all the time. This is where the producer sits, switching on to various studios according as sounds are to come through. The producer is never in the room with the actors. He listens with earphones and then corrects them through a loudspeaker. I was fascinated watching it all. Now, without underplaying the difficulties that Deevy encountered in writing for radio as a deaf woman, I want to spend some time today considering Deevy's genuine enthusiasm for the medium, an enthusiasm that comes through clearly in this letter to her close friend. Instead of understanding Deevy's radio writing as an aberration in her career, I want to look at how radio drama allowed Deevy to experiment with techniques for representing the unseen. As in her description of the studio, Deevy is drawn to what remains out of sight. In the case of her letter to Hackett, she traces what became visible to her when she visited the studio and emphasizes the role of the panel room, usually imperceptible to a radio listener, as well as the physical separation of the producer from the actors playing their parts. Radio, though often misleadingly referred to as a blind medium, is not really blind at all. In fact, radio drama has a heightened relationship to the visual, which it must represent to listeners at home through words, music, and sound. Deevy saw this in the studio, and the tension that she observed between the seen and the unseen would fuel her writing for the medium. There are no overt references to deafness in Deevy's plays, whether for radio or for the stage. It may be tempting to search her radio plays for representations of deafness, or to examine the auditory aspects of the medium that might have eluded or challenged her as a writer. However, as disability studies have long argued, it is both limiting and biased to approach disability solely in terms of a lack. With this critique in mind, I want to suggest a different tact, exploring Deevy's use of visual imagery and its obfuscation in radio drama. I argue that disability shapes Deevy's work in the ways that she plays with a listener's ability to see, often occluding significant visual information and pushing the listener to imagine scenes that they cannot witness. If we look for deafness in Deevy's plays from the perspective of her inability to hear, we miss out on the nuances of her approach to visuality. In her radio plays, we can see how Deevy uses the blind medium of radio to stage scenes of revelation that we, the listener, cannot access. These plays highlight the difficulty of communicating any sensory experience to others, but also emphasize the spiritual necessity of trying to do so. In plays such as In the Cellar of My Friend and One Look and What It Led to, the action hinges on a scene of spiritual epiphany that other characters, and by extension, the audience, cannot experience. The tension in these plays rests on the difficulty of putting these experiences into words so that they can be shared with others. They are both religious plays about the difficulty of mediation that reveals Deevy's development as a radio writer. And I want to tentatively suggest, offer us a glimpse into an emerging disability aesthetic. Deevy was not born deaf, but rather was deafened as a result of Meniere's disease when she was a 19-year-old college student at University College Dublin. When she moved to London to study lip reading after her diagnosis, education for the deaf was dominated by advocates of oralism, who argued that deaf people should learn to lip read and speak, and who opposed manualist schools that instructed students through signed languages. Deevy's only formal deaf education was in oralism. However, she communicated using a variety of visual strategies, including lip reading, but also finger spelling the alphabet using British Sign Language, note writing, and home signs. Deevy's sister Nell played a central role in Deevy's conversations, as well as her radio listening. Nell would interpret for Deevy using a private system of the home signs that they had developed together. According to her nephew, as Deevy aged, she relied more extensively on BSL, finger spelling, as her ability to read lips deteriorated, and after Nell died in 1954. There was a culture of deafness within Deevy's family. Of the 13 siblings, 3 were deaf or hard of hearing, and 1 sister was deaf-blind. Although Deevy never relied exclusively on lip reading, her oralist education exerted an important influence. Namely, it was at this time that she began regularly attending West End theater productions in order to hone her lip reading skills. As an alternative to sign language, lip reading poses many challenges for the deaf. Some classic examples are the indecipherability of certain words like bear and pear, which look the same, the possibility of lip reading when someone turns away, or the added difficulty of, say, a man wearing a beard or a mustache, or somebody covering their face for a moment while they're speaking. Lip reading, as Deevy learned, involved a constant vacillation between the seen and the unseen. Even before she began writing for radio, Deevy's plays highlighted this tension between visibility and obfuscation. One of her most celebrated stage plays, The King of Spain's Daughter, hinges on this tension. The play's action begins with a wedding off in the distance that the audience cannot see. On stage, Annie arrives with breathless descriptions of the wedding below. To each character, she recounts the beauty of the bride. She tells the first character that the bride is wearing a flaming red dress. Then she proceeds to tell her would-be fiancé, Jim, how the bride was wearing a pale gold dress. He roughly corrects her. "What lies are you telling? I saw her myself. She was dressed in gray." According to her father, she is a consummate liar who lives off fantasies rather than the truth. However, the play is sympathetic to Annie's version and depicts her as a visionary in several senses of the word. She is someone who is able to or accustomed to see visions, capable of receiving impressions or obtaining knowledge by means of vision. And she is also given to fanciful and unpractical views, having little regard to what is actual or possible, speculative, dreamy. Because the wedding party inhabits space off stage, the audience is reliant on Annie's descriptions until she is rebuked by Jim, who provides the seemingly objective truth. While Jim indicts her for the unpracticality of her vision and its divorce from reality, a sympathetic audience will find themselves drawn to the technicolor vision that Annie offers over Jim's staid version. Deevy's later radio plays exploit the fact that the audience is fully reliant on her characters for their ability to see. In these plays, there are no corroborating characters to provide testimony to reality. Instead, they must try to communicate an entirely subjective vision to an audience that may or may not be disposed to believe them. Moving on to Deevy's radio plays, it would be easy to conclude that she never quite leaves stagecraft behind. Her 1954 radio play In the Cellar of My Friend was rejected by Radio Erin because it was not considered radiogenic enough. When Deavy submitted the manuscript, the producer, Michael O'Hay, wrote back to say that they could not air it because much of the play depends on the visual, and I fear that the atmosphere would be lost. In this rejection, O'Hay rightly points out the importance of the visual to the script, and may have been particularly concerned about a scene in which one character eavesdrops on another, a scene that would be hard to render on air, when the listener cannot see a character silently listening in. However, what O'Hay misses in his rejection is how much of the play concerns itself with what cannot be seen. The central crisis of the play comes when a young man, Barney, breaks off his engagement with his neighbor Belle after experiencing a spiritual epiphany and deciding to become a monk. The play's action is set the day after the epiphany, as Belle discovers the engagement is off and Barney falters in articulating his reasons. Not only is Barney unable to say what he means, but a letter that he has sent to Belle by way of explanation does not reach her. And we find out that it has been left at her door and eaten by a dog. Barney, in trying to communicate the experience, speaks very softly. He tells Belle, "Last night something happened. I was invited by God to come nearer. Not the first time, but always before I had drawn back, dreading. Last night, being happy, I went on. In spirit, I mean. I opened the door, or it was opened for me. Something was offered. How foolish is all our dreading. Our withdrawals, hesitations, how utterly foolish." Later, Barney discovers that the letter where he tried to communicate this experience has been torn in fragments and says, "Belle, I thought I had written something that mattered. Going now, leaving fragments, only fit for waste paper basket." The play ends with Belle expressing a desire to say nothing, delivered in a tone that is, according to the stage directions, scarcely audible. The fading out of sound at the end mirrors the fragmented letters. The tragedy of the play is not so much the breakup of the relationship between Barney and Belle, but Barney's failure to communicate his spiritual experience to the person who most badly needed to understand it. In going off to become a monk, he takes his spiritual epiphany with him and fails in his endeavor to share it with another. If In the Cellar of My Friend never quite loses the residual traces of a stage play, her late radio play, One Look and What It Led To, from 1964, 10 years later, continues to explore the difficulty of communicating a visionary experience. This one is a truly radiogenic work that reflects Deavy's decades-long consideration of the radio medium. The play continuously exploits the idea of radio as a theater of the mind, where visual imagery exists as a mental construct rather than as something externally verifiable. Even more explicitly religious than in The Cellar of My Friend, One Look tells the story of Mary Magdalene, and it aired on Radio Erin during Lent. Unlike Deavy's earlier, more stage-bound writing, the scenes here move rapidly through time and space, taking us first to Lazarus' funeral, then the feast where Mary Magdalene washes Christ's feet with her hair, then the crucifixion, then the discovery of the empty tomb, and finally to Mary Magdalene's final hermitage in France. These rapid scene changes are possible because radio drama is untethered to a fixed stage setting. If Deavy's earlier plays continue to conform to the kitchen sink drama constraints of the Abbey Theatre, One Look and What It Led To finally explodes these limits. In these changing scenes, Deavy repeatedly creates a divide between foreground and background, both of which are, of course, invisible to the listener. And I have a sort of clunky drawing of this, trying to kind of give you a visual of what I'm describing between the foreground and the visual in these radio plays. In these scenes, the listener is placed in the foreground with anonymous villagers who are experiencing the scenes of Christ's miracles from a distance. Although there are no extant recordings of this radio production that I'm aware of, the script suggests that producers may have made use of what Neil Verma describes as audio position, or the strategic arrangement of microphones to denote distance. By miking the foreground characters more closely than those in the background, the listener would be brought into a more intimate relationship to the foregrounded characters than those heard at a distance. In the first scene, the listener is placed in the foreground among a group of villagers and onlookers who watch Lazarus's funeral procession from a distance, narrating the events happening below. Some of these characters are remarking on Christ's miracles with a sense of awe, while others jeer in derision. They are joined by a skeptical Mary Magdalene and her friend Joanna. As the procession passes below, we are told that Christ looks up at Mary Magdalene. The listener, again, cannot see Christ or the exchange of looks, but Mary Magdalene describes the experience to her friend. She says, "Joanna, he looked at me. He looked. From that distance, he saw me. As if we were close together, he saw me, saw what I am, and yet loved me. How can I thank him? I was full of evil, trapped by devils. They're gone now, banished by one look. Oh, most lovely. Never again can they dominate me. I have that look." Unlike Barnaby, the erstwhile monk, Mary Magdalene is able to communicate her visionary experience of seeing and being seen. And yet listeners are unable to share Christ's look. They are onlookers who cannot see and must decide, based on visual description alone, whether to believe or remain skeptical. In the play's final scene, Deavy takes the listener even further in time and space, focalizing the action through the eyes and ears of a young French couple who have entered Mary Magdalene's hermitage and eavesdrop on her speaking to Christ. They cannot see or hear Christ, but only Mary Magdalene's one-sided conversation with him. Despite never directly witnessing Christ's appearance to Mary Magdalene, they leave the hermitage feeling a glow of love surrounding them. Here, the spiritual stakes of visionary experience are crystal clear. If one look leads to salvation for Mary Magdalene, and we as radio listeners cannot share the look or witness it, then we must rely on others to communicate a visionary experience. Here in this play, it is salvation that is at stake. In Deavy's most radiogenic play, belief requires finding ways to see that which eludes our eyes. If this theme feels alienatingly religious to a secular audience, it is also important to note the ways in which Deavy's depictions of visionary experience are essential to her writing about art, as well as her writing about religion. In her play, Light Falling, which was directed for the stage by Ria Mooney at the Abbey Experimental Theatre in 1948, and later by Jack McGowan at the Lyric Theatre in 1956, we see this spiritual imperative mapped onto a secular aesthetics. In this play, a British painter and his wife visit a rural Irish countryside and inadvertently shake up the fragile foundations of a young Irish couple. In several scenes of dialogue between the painter, Kenneth Leslie, and the aging father of the household, Pat, the titular Light Falling is revealed to be a secular version of visionary experience. Mr. Leslie tells Pat, "For me, truth is embodied in light falling. If I can get that down on canvas, others will see in it the eternal mystery, the beneficence. Oh, damn it all, that's nothing new. Others have said it, thousands of others. Yet I must say it my own way. I must capture the moment." Now, despite the spiritual intensity of Leslie's depiction of art, Deavy inserts a profane "damn it all" to remind us that this is not a religious man and that this is a secular vision. As a painter, Kenneth understands epiphany as a visual phenomenon that he seeks to capture in his portraits. But capturing a visual experience is not enough. Leslie's challenge is to capture it in such a way that others can share it, to make the visionary credible and communicable. So I'd like to end with some thoughts that I'm afraid may be more suggestive than persuasive, but that I hope can be a jumping off point for further consideration. I want to ask what happens if we consider Deevy's representations of the visual as part of a disability aesthetic in her work. Her characters, in struggling to describe sensory experiences, often occupy the position of visionaries whose visions are occluded by the social, cultural, and technological constraints of language and its transmission. Her radio plays, especially late in her career, make use of the formal properties of the radio medium to emphasize the instability of vision, its elusive and subjective qualities. She depicts characters charged with the need to communicate a visionary experience and the difficulty of making that experience accessible to others. Deevy makes visuality central to her radio works, but it is a visuality with a difference, one that does not presume clarity or a stable visual object. Deevy's radio plays untether visuality from a normative reality and launch visual representation into the realm of the visionary. Thank you very much.